An unexpected challenge. Keanu Reeves had always been known for his kindness, but even the kindest souls had their moments of exhaustion. He had been filming back-to-back for weeks, and his body begged for rest. His latest project had drained him mentally, an intense psychological thriller that required every ounce of his emotional energy. That evening, he found himself wandering into a quiet, high-end restaurant in New York, hoping to escape the noise of Hollywood for just one night. He didn't want to be recognized. He didn't want to be admired. He just wanted a meal, some solitude, and maybe, just maybe, a fleeting sense of normalcy. The dimly lit ambience was perfect. Soft jazz played in the background, and the warm, inviting glow of candlelight flickered across polished mahogany tables. He exhaled deeply as he settled into a quiet corner, away from prying eyes. Emily Carter moved between tables, balancing plates with precision and offering polite smiles to customers who barely noticed her. She had been working here for the past 3 years, juggling long shifts while trying to keep her dreams alive. Music was her true passion, but passion didn't pay the bills. She spent her days waitressing, her nights practicing on an old, out-of-tune piano in her tiny apartment. She recognized Keanu immediately, but didn't react. Celebrities came and went in this part of the city, and she had learned to treat them like any other guest. As she approached his table, her hands trembled slightly from the exhaustion of a double shift. She placed the menu in front of him and was about to walk away when the glass of water she was carrying wobbled dangerously. Keanu caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. His reflex was quick, but before he could reach, a few drops of water splashed onto the table. She gasped quietly, stepping back. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Keanu, in his fatigue, let out a small, dry chuckle. "Steady hands are important for a waitress, don't you think?" His tone was light, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Emily stiffened, the words cutting deeper than she expected. She was used to dealing with difficult customers, but somehow, this one stung differently. Maybe because she respected him. Maybe because she had spent years admiring his work, believing him to be the kind of person who wouldn't judge so quickly. She could have apologized again, could have let the moment pass, but something inside her flared. She had spent too many years being overlooked, dismissed, made to feel small. Keanu, unaware of the turmoil his words had caused, glanced at the grand piano tucked into the far corner of the restaurant. It sat there, untouched, collecting dust, its ivory keys gleaming under the dim light. He motioned toward it. "Do people ever play that?" he asked, directing his question to a nearby waiter who had just walked past. The waiter, an older man who had been working there for years, smiled. "Oh, Emily plays sometimes. She's something special." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He leaned back in his chair, a flicker of curiosity igniting. "I don't know. With those shaky hands, are you sure about that?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Emily felt the weight of them. A slow, unfamiliar fire built in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was anger or determination, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let the moment define her. The restaurant had grown quieter. A few patrons had overheard. Their interest peaked. Keanu was famous, after all, and people tended to pay attention when a celebrity spoke. For a brief moment, she hesitated. Every ounce of her insecurity screamed at her to back away, to stay in the shadows, where it was safe. But then another voice, stronger, clearer, pushed through. No. She had spent her whole life waiting for someone to see her, to notice what she could do. Now fate had placed her in front of a man who had the power to do just that. It didn't matter how it had happened. What mattered was what she did next. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the piano. The moment her fingers brushed the keys, a shiver ran through her. This was where she belonged, not carrying trays, not apologizing for tiny mistakes, but here, creating something that couldn't be ignored. Keanu watched as she sat down, curiosity shifting into something deeper. He had expected her to back down, maybe laugh off the moment and move on. Instead, she had accepted the challenge without a word. And then she played. The sound of defiance. The first note struck the air like a drop of water hitting still glass, sending ripples of sound through the restaurant. Keanu leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping lightly against the table, expecting a simple melody, maybe something rehearsed and safe. But the moment Emily's hands fully settled on the keys, he realized how wrong he had been. The music erupted, not in timid, practiced strokes, but with raw, untamed emotion. It wasn't the delicate, refined playing of someone who had learned in pristine music halls under the guidance of strict instructors. No, this was something different. This was fire and storm, the sound of struggle and resilience. The notes carried something deep, something unspoken but intensely felt, like a voice that had been silenced for too long and was finally breaking free. A hush fell over the restaurant. Conversations faded into nothing as the melody took hold. Waiters, mid-step, turned their heads. Diners, forks halfway to their mouths, paused. The sound wasn't just music, it was storytelling in its purest form. Each note painted a picture of long nights spent alone, of fingers aching from practice, of dreams that had been forced into the background of a life filled with survival. Keanu's smirk disappeared. He had come in tired, irritated, and slightly detached from the world around him. But now, something inside him stirred. His gaze was locked on the young woman at the piano, watching as her entire being became one with the music. It was as if the instrument had been waiting for her all this time, longing for someone to wake it from its silence. Emily didn't think about the audience anymore. She didn't think about Keanu Reeves sitting there, watching her, or about the fact that just moments ago, she had felt small under his words. None of that mattered. All that mattered was this moment, the chance to finally, truly be seen, not as a waitress fumbling with glasses, not as another anonymous face blending into the background, but as an artist, a musician, someone who had something to say. The melody shifted, softening into something delicate, bittersweet. It spoke of childhood dreams, of the way she had once believed that talent alone was enough to carve a future. It spoke of sacrifices, of jobs that stole away her time, of pianos she had played in secret when no one was listening. Then, just as the audience thought they had grasped the emotion of the piece, it changed again, rising, bold and unrelenting, as if daring the world to try and silence her again. Keanu felt something tighten in his chest. He had heard thousands of musicians before. He had been to the most expensive performances, had seen the most polished professionals deliver flawless compositions. But this was different. This was not flawless. It was better. It was real. When the final note rang out, it didn't just fade into the air. It lingered, hanging there, refusing to be forgotten. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. A heavy, almost sacred pause. And then, applause. It started hesitantly, as if the audience wasn't sure if they were allowed to break the spell that had been cast over the room. But then, it swelled, growing louder, people rising to their feet, clapping, cheering. A few even whistled, shaking their heads in disbelief. Emily sat there, her fingers still resting on the keys, her chest rising and falling rapidly. She had done it. Not just played, but played, the way she had always wanted to, the way she had always known she could. Keanu was still staring at her, not with arrogance, not with condescension, but with something entirely different. Awe. As the applause finally began to settle, he stood up slowly and walked toward her. Emily felt her pulse quicken, unsure of what he was going to say. Was he going to dismiss it? Make another remark? But when he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost thoughtful. That was incredible. Emily let out a slow breath. She met his gaze, seeing none of the arrogance from before. There was something else in his expression now. Respect. Thank you, she said simply. Keanu hesitated for a moment before shaking his head slightly, as if still processing what had just happened. Where did you learn to play like that? Emily glanced down at the keys, tracing a finger along their smooth surface. I taught myself. I've been playing since I was a kid. No lessons? He asked, his brows raising. She shook her head. Not formally. Just a lot of practice. A lot of listening. Keanu exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. You know, I came in here tonight thinking I was the one who had the long day. But whatever I was dealing with feels pretty small compared to what I just heard. Emily blinked. She hadn't expected that. She hadn't expected any of this. The restaurant was still buzzing, people whispering about the unexpected performance, waiters exchanging impressed looks. Somewhere in the back, the restaurant manager had already begun brainstorming ways to use this moment for publicity. Keanu glanced back at his table before looking at Emily again. Listen, I don't know what your plans are, but you shouldn't be serving tables. Emily tensed. She had heard that before, from people who meant well but didn't understand how the world worked. She needed this job. She needed stability. Dreams didn't pay rent. So, she shrugged, offering the same polite smile she gave difficult customers. Music doesn't exactly cover the bills. Keanu's lips pressed into a thin line. He could tell she was used to this conversation, used to people making promises that led nowhere. But he wasn't just anyone. He pulled a card from his jacket and set it on the piano. That performance was worth way more than tips, he said, his voice steady. If you ever want to change that, give me a call. Emily stared at the card. She could feel the weight of this moment, the possibility of it. But possibility was terrifying. Keanu didn't wait for an answer. He simply gave her a final nod before walking back to his table, as if knowing that the real decision wasn't his to make. It was hers. And for the first time in a long time, Emily realized, maybe, just maybe, she had finally been given a real chance. A humbling offer. Emily stared at the small white card on the polished piano surface. The name printed in bold letters wasn't just recognizable. It carried weight, influence, and the kind of opportunity most people spent their entire lives chasing. Keanu Reeves. Below his name was a number, along with an email address. It wasn't flashy, no corporate branding or manager's contact. Just a direct line to him. It felt personal. Too personal. Too real. She hesitated before picking it up, her fingers grazing over the edges. The weight of the moment pressed down on her. How many times had she dreamed of this? Of someone noticing, someone important enough to open doors she couldn't even reach the handle of. Yet now that the moment had arrived, it felt unreal, like a trick her mind was playing on her. The buzz in the restaurant had not died down. Even as Keanu returned to his seat, people whispered about what had just happened. A waitress turned pianist. A Hollywood star stunned into admiration. It sounded like the kind of story tabloids would spin into something exaggerated, yet every word of it was true. Emily tucked the card into her apron pocket, unsure what to do with it. Part of her wanted to believe in the offer, to accept that maybe, just maybe, this was a door finally opening. But another part of her, the part that had been let down too many times, warned her not to get her hopes up. She finished her shift in a daze, moving mechanically through her remaining tables, forcing herself to focus on refilling drinks and clearing plates instead of the storm of uncertainty brewing inside her. When the restaurant finally emptied out and the last guests had paid their checks, she slipped into the back room, leaning against the lockers, her heart still pounding. Her coworker, Carla, smirked as she pulled off her apron. "So, are you gonna call them?" Emily blinked. "What?" Carla rolled her eyes. "Don't play dumb. Keanu Reeves just handed you a golden ticket. What's stopping you?" Emily let out a hollow laugh. "Because things like this don't just happen. People don't just get discovered overnight." Carla raised an eyebrow. "They don't." She gestured toward the piano outside. "Because that sure looked like the start of something to me." Emily sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Even if I call, then what?" "He said he knows people." "People. That means 100 different things. What if it's just a polite way of saying you're good, but don't quit your day job? Carla leaned against the lockers, crossing her arms. Look, I get it. You don't trust this. You don't want to get your hopes up and have them crushed. But let me ask you this. What's the alternative? You stay here, waiting tables for the next 5 years, playing piano in an empty apartment for nobody. Emily swallowed hard. That was the thing. She had accepted, for so long, that this was her life. That her talent was something she had to keep in the background because the world didn't work the way it did in movies. Dreams stayed dreams. Real life was about survival. But wasn't this real life too? Hadn't she just played for an entire restaurant, leaving them breathless? Hadn't Keanu Reeves, one of the biggest names in Hollywood, looked at her like she was something extraordinary? She took a deep breath and pulled the card from her pocket, staring at it. The number stared back at her, daring her to use it. That night, she sat in her tiny apartment, the city lights blinking through the window. Her ancient keyboard sat against the wall, the black and white keys worn from years of use. She had spent countless nights here, playing for no one, the sound of her music filling the silence of her solitude. She stared at her phone, the number already dialed, her thumb hovering over the call button. She took a breath, told herself it was just a conversation, nothing more. And then, before she could talk herself out of it, she pressed call. It rang once, twice, a third time. Then, hello. Her breath caught. His voice was unmistakable, even over the phone. Smooth, warm, yet carrying the slightest hint of surprise, as if he hadn't expected her to actually call. Hi, she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. It's Emily. From the restaurant. A pause. Then something in his tone shifted. Recognition, followed by something that almost sounded like relief. I was hoping you'd call. She swallowed. Yeah, well, here I am. Keanu chuckled lightly. Good. I meant what I said, you know, about helping you. Emily exhaled slowly. And what does that actually mean? A brief silence. Then, meet me tomorrow, he said. I want to introduce you to someone. The words landed heavily in her chest. This wasn't just a vague promise. This was real. She hesitated for only a second before nodding, as if he could see her through the phone. Okay. Great. I'll send you the details. As soon as she hung up, she stared at the screen, half expecting the call to have been a dream. But the number was still there, the call history proving that it had happened. She had said yes. For the first time in years, she had said yes to something uncertain. And for the first time, it felt like maybe, just maybe, it would change everything. Breaking chains. Emily barely slept that night. The city hummed outside her window, the distant sounds of sirens and honking taxis blending into the thoughts racing through her mind. She had replayed the conversation with Keanu 100 times, half convinced that she had imagined the entire thing. But there it was, the call history on her phone, the text he had sent with the address of a music studio, the undeniable proof that something real was happening. But even with that proof, doubt crept in. She wasn't supposed to be here. People like her didn't get moments like this. It was a cruel trick, wasn't it? The world didn't just open doors because you played one good song in a restaurant. And yet, it had. By the time morning arrived, she was running on coffee and anxiety, her hands trembling slightly as she stood outside the studio Keanu had directed her to. It was an unassuming building tucked between towering glass offices, the kind of place you'd walk past without noticing unless you knew what was inside. She pulled in a deep breath and pushed open the door. The lobby was sleek and modern, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and faint traces of espresso. A receptionist glanced up, her expression shifting into a knowing smile as she motioned toward the back hallway. Keanu's already inside. Go ahead. Emily nodded, adjusting the strap of her bag as she walked through the hallway, her boots tapping against the hardwood floor. Each step felt heavier than the last. What if she wasn't good enough? What if she had only seemed impressive in that moment at the restaurant? But now, in a real setting, she fell apart. Before she could spiral any further, she reached the last door on the right. It was slightly ajar. She hesitated before nudging it open. Inside, Keanu was leaning against the studio console, deep in conversation with another man. The stranger was in his mid-50s, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, his silver hair swept back in an effortlessly cool way. His hands were folded across his chest, and there was something intense in his gaze, like someone who had spent years searching for raw talent and knew it the moment he saw it. Keanu looked up first. A grin broke across his face. "You came." Emily forced a small smile. "I did." The older man studied her, his sharp blue eyes narrowing slightly. "So, you're the Waitress pianist I've been hearing about." She tensed, bracing herself for the skepticism that usually followed that statement. "I guess so." Keanu chuckled. "Emily, this is Victor Hale. He's been producing for 30 years, worked with some of the best in the industry." Victor extended a hand, his grip firm but not overbearing. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said. "Keanu doesn't usually call in favors. When he does, it's for a damn good reason. That means I have to hear this for myself." Emily's throat went dry. She had prepared for this, hadn't she? She had practiced for years, dreamed of playing in a real studio. But now that she was standing here, under the scrutiny of someone who had actual power in the industry, the weight of it all pressed down on her. Keanu must have sensed her hesitation because he gave her a reassuring nod. "You don't have to prove anything, Emily. Just play." She exhaled slowly, then glanced around. There, in the corner of the studio, sat a grand piano, its glossy black surface gleaming under the dim lights. It was bigger than anything she had ever played on before. Swallowing the lump in her throat, she walked over, pulling off her jacket and settling onto the bench. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, her mind blank. Then she thought about the first song she ever wrote, the one she had played in her tiny apartment when the world felt too heavy, when she had convinced herself she would never be more than a nameless musician in the background of other people's lives. She closed her eyes, and she played. The first note was hesitant, but the next carried more weight, and then suddenly, the fear melted away. Emily forgot about the studio. She forgot about Victor's piercing gaze and the fact that Keanu Reeves was watching her. She forgot about the self-doubt that had been her companion for years. She played as if she were alone, as if this was just another night in her apartment, pouring her soul into the music. The melody swelled, telling a story of struggle and longing, of small victories and quiet resilience. It was haunting, beautiful, unapologetically raw. When the last note rang out, the silence stretched long. She opened her eyes, breathless. Victor hadn't moved. His expression was unreadable, his fingers steepled together as if considering something far beyond the walls of this studio. Then, slowly, he leaned back in his chair and let out a low breath. "Jesus Christ." Keanu grinned. "That's a good sign." Victor shook his head, a rare kind of admiration flickering across his face. That wasn't just playing. That was. He paused, searching for the right words. That was a goddamn experience. Emily's heart pounded. "So, is that a good thing?" Victor let out a short laugh. "Kid, that's the best thing." She exhaled sharply, her grip on the piano loosening slightly. Keanu clapped a hand on her shoulder. "Told you." Victor was already flipping through his notes, muttering to himself. "I can work with this. I can definitely work with this. You don't just play music, you feel it. That's rare. That's special." Emily couldn't believe what she was hearing. Victor looked up, all business now. "Here's the deal. I don't make false promises, and I don't waste time. You have talent, real talent. I want to help you get that out into the world." Emily's pulse quickened. "How?" "First, we get you in a proper studio session. No more playing on second-hand keyboards in your apartment. We record, we produce, we build something. But if we do this, we do it right. She hesitated. It sounded huge, impossible. Victor caught the uncertainty in her eyes and softened his tone. Look, Emily, I know what it feels like to hesitate, to think maybe you're not ready. But trust me, you are. Keanu crossed his arms, a knowing smile on his face. No pressure. But if you say no, I'm definitely coming back to that restaurant and making you play in front of me again. Emily let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. It was terrifying. It was overwhelming. But it was real. She had been waiting for years, trapped in the cycle of waiting tables, playing for no one, keeping her dreams locked away. But maybe it was time to break that cycle. Maybe it was time to say yes. So she did. Shadows of doubt. Emily had thought saying yes would make everything easier. That once she made the decision to step into this new world, her fears would dissolve, replaced by excitement and momentum. But as the days passed, reality set in. The music industry wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't just about raw talent and passion. It was about business, about image, about learning how to navigate an industry that had swallowed up dreamers and spit them out before they ever had a chance to shine. She spent the next few days in the studio with Victor, working through the first real recording session of her life. The grand piano under her fingers wasn't worn down like the one in her apartment. It was pristine, its notes sharper, clearer. The sound quality in the studio was nothing like what she was used to. Every note felt magnified, every hesitation amplified. Victor pushed her hard, harder than she expected. That transition was sloppy, he said on the third take. She exhaled, shaking out her hands. I thought it sounded fine. It did. Fine isn't what we're aiming for. Keanu was there for most of it, sitting in the corner of the studio, sipping coffee and occasionally flashing her a thumbs up when he could tell she was struggling. He didn't interfere, didn't tell Victor to go easy on her. He let her fight through it. By the time they wrapped for the day, Emily's hands ached, her body slumping against the piano bench. Victor had been relentless. She expected some kind of reassurance from him, maybe a small acknowledgement that she had pushed through. Instead, he simply studied her for a long moment and then said, "Come back tomorrow. We'll do it again." Emily felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't that she couldn't handle criticism. She had spent her whole life proving herself to people who never really looked at her twice. But this was different. This wasn't just some snide remark from a customer at the restaurant, or a dismissive comment from a teacher who didn't believe in her. This was real pressure, the kind that made her question if she had made a mistake by agreeing to this. She walked out of the studio feeling small. Keanu caught up to her as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold city air biting against her skin. "You okay?" he asked. She let out a slow breath, crossing her arms. "I don't know." Keanu gave her a knowing look, shoving his hands into his jacket pockets. "You're overthinking." Emily huffed. "Victor thinks I'm not good enough." "No, Victor thinks you can be better." She glanced at him. "There's a difference. A huge one." He smiled slightly. "If he didn't think you had something special, he wouldn't waste his time pushing you." Emily looked down at her hands, flexing her fingers. "I just never had anyone expect this much from me before. It's scary." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, it is. But that's what growth feels like." They stood there in silence for a moment, the city moving around them. Cars passed, people walked by, conversations floated through the air, but Emily felt like she was standing on the edge of something bigger than herself. "You know," Keanu said after a while, "when I started acting, I sucked." She raised an eyebrow. "I highly doubt that." He laughed. "No, really. I was bad. Wooden. Stiff. I kept thinking, what if I'm not good enough? What if I'm just fooling myself?" Emily frowned. "What changed?" Keanu tilted his head, thinking. "I stopped letting the fear win." He looked at her then, his gaze steady. "You can be scared, Emily. Just don't let it stop you." Her throat tightened. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that she was capable of more, that Victor's harsh critiques weren't a sign that she was failing but proof that she was being taken seriously. But doubt was a stubborn thing. She spent the next few days trapped between hope and fear. The studio sessions became more intense, and with every note she played, she felt like she was unraveling. One moment, she was convinced she was exactly where she was meant to be. The next, she was certain she was an imposter, a waitress pretending to be something she wasn't. One night, after a particularly brutal session, she found herself standing outside her old restaurant, staring through the window. Inside, the waitstaff bustled around, moving between tables, balancing trays, taking orders. Her old manager stood at the bar, counting tips, her expression as weary as Emily remembered. She could walk back in right now. She could slip on an apron, fall back into the routine she knew so well. It would be easy, predictable, safe. But the thought of going back to that life made her stomach twist. She didn't want easy anymore. Taking a deep breath, she stepped back and turned away from the restaurant. The next morning, she walked into the studio with a new kind of determination. Victor raised an eyebrow as she sat at the piano. "You look different." She flexed her fingers, meeting his gaze. "I'm ready." He studied her for a moment, then simply nodded. "Good. Let's get to work." And this time, she didn't let the fear win. Rising notes. Emily had never known exhaustion like this before. Music had always been her refuge, her escape. But now, it was her battlefield. Every day in the studio with Victor was a war between self-doubt and ambition. She played until her fingers ached, recorded until she couldn't hear the difference between good and great. Victor was unrelenting, demanding more with each session, pushing her past the limits she thought she had. Again, he would say after she finished what she thought was a flawless take. Again, after she had poured everything into a song, sweat gathering on her temples, her hands trembling slightly from the pressure. At first, it frustrated her. She wanted validation, proof that she was getting better. But Keanu had warned her. Victor didn't waste time on people who weren't worth it. He wouldn't push her like this if he didn't believe she could handle it. And so, she kept going. Weeks passed. She no longer second-guessed every note, no longer shrank under Victor's critiques. Her fingers moved with confidence now, her instincts sharper, her emotions woven into every melody. The rough edges of her music had been refined, but not polished away. Victor was careful not to strip the rawness that made her special. Then came the moment she had been dreading. A live performance. It was just a small venue, intimate, no flashing lights or roaring crowds. But to Emily, it felt massive. This was different from the restaurant, different from the safety of playing for people who weren't expecting much. Here, people came to listen. Here, they would judge her as a musician, not as a waitress who happened to have a hidden talent. She almost said no, almost convinced herself she wasn't ready. But then Keanu reminded her, in that quiet way he had, fear is a terrible reason to back down. So she said yes. The night of the performance, she sat backstage, her heart a wild drumbeat in her chest. The venue was dimly lit, the stage set up with nothing but a spotlight and a grand piano. The audience murmured softly, waiting. She felt like a fraud, like she had fooled them all into thinking she belonged here. Then Keanu appeared beside her, holding out a bottle of water. "Breathe." She took it, her fingers tightening around the plastic. "I don't know if I can do this." Keanu crouched slightly to meet her gaze. "You already did it once. Remember that night at the restaurant? You played without thinking, without fear. You can do that again." She swallowed hard. What if they don't like it? Keanu shrugged. Then they don't. But what if they love it? She exhaled, trying to steady herself. He made it sound simple. Maybe it was. Maybe she was the one making it more complicated than it needed to be. When the announcer called her name, the room swam slightly as she stood. Every step toward the stage felt heavier than the last. She sat at the piano, blinking under the lights, and for a brief, terrifying moment, her mind went completely blank. Then she glanced at the front row. Keanu was there. So was Victor, his arms crossed, watching her with quiet expectation. And then, Carla, her old coworker from the restaurant, grinning like she had just won a bet. A slow smile tugged at Emily's lips. She placed her fingers on the keys. And she played. The first few notes trembled, uncertain. But as the melody unfolded, her nerves melted away. She wasn't just performing. She was telling her story. She played the struggle. The years of working dead-end jobs, feeling invisible. The long nights in her tiny apartment, playing for no one. The moment when everything changed. The restaurant, the challenge, the first time she felt truly seen. The music swelled, bold and unafraid. By the time she hit the last note, the silence that followed was deafening. Then, thunderous applause. Emily sat there, breathless, the echoes of the performance still vibrating in her bones. Keanu was the first to stand. Victor followed, and then the rest of the audience, rising to their feet, clapping, cheering. Emily pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed. For the first time, she wasn't just a girl with a dream. She was a musician, and she belonged here. A legacy of music. The applause didn't fade. It roared through the small venue, filling every crevice of the space, pounding in Emily's chest like a second heartbeat. She sat there at the piano, hands still trembling over the keys, unsure of what to do. The sound felt unreal, like a dream she might wake from at any second. Then, from the front row, Keanu grinned and whistled, clapping harder. That did it. The tension in her shoulders loosened, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She stood from the piano bench, giving the audience a small, almost hesitant nod. This was real. As she stepped off the stage, people were already rushing toward her. Strangers, musicians, producers, and even reporters who had slipped into the crowd at the last moment. Some offered congratulations, some praised her performance, others shoved business cards into her hands, telling her to call me. It was overwhelming, but the moment that mattered was when Victor walked up, his sharp gaze unreadable. For a long second, he said nothing, just studied her with that critical producer's eye. Then, with a small smirk, he clapped a hand on her shoulder. "You've got something rare, kid." And tonight proved it. Emily exhaled, a rush of relief flooding through her. Victor Hale wasn't the kind of man to give false praise. If he said she had something, he meant it. Keanu appeared at her side, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, looking at her with something like pride. "Told you they'd love it." She let out a breathless laugh, shaking her head. "I still can't believe this just happened." "Well, believe it." He motioned toward the room, where people were still buzzing about her performance. "This is only the beginning." She knew he was right. That night changed everything. Within days, Victor had her back in the studio, this time with a team. No more rough recordings, no more hesitation. They worked on an original composition, something that would introduce her sound to the world. It was terrifying, thrilling, and exhausting all at once. But Emily didn't back down. She had spent too long doubting herself, too long hiding behind excuses. Now, for the first time, she was stepping fully into the life she had always wanted. Keanu stayed involved, popping into the studio now and then, sometimes just to listen, sometimes to offer encouragement. She learned quickly that he didn't see himself as some kind of savior. He wasn't here to rescue her or take credit for her success. He had simply given her a chance. And that was more than enough. Months passed in a blur. Her first song was released, and it caught fire in a way none of them expected. People latched onto her story, the waitress-turned-musician, the woman who had stunned Keanu Reeves with her raw talent. Articles were written. Interviews were requested. Offers from labels started rolling in. But through it all, Emily remained herself. She played like she always had, with emotion, with fire, with the kind of depth that couldn't be manufactured. And the world took notice. One night, months after that first performance, she stood in the wings of a much larger stage, waiting for her cue. The venue was packed, thousands of people waiting to hear her play. The lights were hot, the air electric with anticipation. She was nervous, but not afraid, because she knew now this was where she belonged. Just before she walked on stage, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message. Keanu, show them what I saw that night. She smiled. Then, with steady hands, she stepped onto the stage, sat at the grand piano, and let the music tell the rest of the story. A story that had only just begun.